Welcome to the Resilient series. I'm Stephanie Weaver, the author of the Migraine Relief Plan and the upcoming Migraine Relief Plan cookbook. And for that project, I'm interviewing a variety of people about the topic of resilience. My guest today is Melissa Gould. Melissa is an essayist and award-winning screenwriter who's worked on shows like Party of Five, one of my favorites, Lizzie McGuire, and Bill Nye the Science Guy. And her debut book is entitled Widowish. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
It's great to have you here. So tell us briefly where you were at in your life when your husband Joel first got sick.
Okay, well, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2008. Our daughter, who was an only child, was 8 years old at the time, and I was a gainfully employed screenwriter. I think I was pitching a movie or writing a movie. Joel was the co owner of a music marketing company, and our life was good. We live in Los Angeles, and we were very happy and vibrant couple and family. And when Joel got this diagnosis, it was devastating, as most serious illness diagnoses can be. Um, for Joel, it's because he was so active. His physical health was really important to him. He played basketball once a week. He was on a softball team once a week. He played racquetball a few times a week. He went to the gym every day. So he really was an active guy. And what MS really does is compromise your mobility. So typically people don't die from multiple sclerosis, but it does affect the quality of your life. So when I say we got the diagnosis, because it does affect the entire family, it was devastating. But Joel made changes to his life that helped him really manage the disease. He was on a course of treatment and medication that really helped. He swapped out basketball for yoga. He traded racquetball for bike riding, and he was managing, and he was doing well, and life was good. And a few years later, the first medication that he had been on for all of those years stopped being as effective, which we learned that's what happens when you have a serious autoimmune disease. Frequently, the medications have a lifespan. Um, so we were transitioning from one medication to another. And it was during that time, and this was 5 years later, 6 years later, that he started to really suffer from the symptoms of MS, and things in our life really started to change.
Yeah, and you talk about that. So now your daughter's 13, right?
Mhm.
Or was 13, and then suddenly Joel takes a turn for the worse. I think it's fair to say, right? So tell us about that. What happened?
Right. So the year 2013 was a big year in our family because, like you said, our daughter was turning 13 and having her bat mitzvah. Joel was turning 50. But at the very beginning of the year, really starting in January, the medication he had been on stopped being as effective. Joel started to have a lot of difficulty doing just everyday things like walking. Um, he would do something simple like empty the dishwasher, and he would have to sleep for like 2 or 3 hours afterwards. He was getting fatigued. He was not feeling as sharp, and he couldn't move as easily. And the doctors put him on a new medication that just was not kicking in. And so for months, he was really suffering and really struggling with the MS. Um, and in the summer, he got very sick with what we thought was the flu. And we made the decision together to take him to the hospital. He was able to communicate with the doctors that he wasn't feeling well. And they weren't sure at the time if this was the flu or if it was a reaction to the new medication. And there was a lot of confusion in the hospital. There was a lot of guessing, even though the doctors were brilliant at what they did. This really didn't present like MS. They thought perhaps it was a virus, and they kept circling that from the beginning, that they were looking for a rash or a bite or something that might indicate that this was a virus. They were testing for all of these things. Everything kept coming back negative. So it was a really excruciating time. Joel fell into a coma 2 days after he walked himself into the hospital. And 3 weeks later, he died of complications of multiple sclerosis and West Nile virus. And it took those entire 3 weeks of him being in the hospital for them to determine that it was West Nile virus.
Yeah, and when I got to that part in your book, that was so frustrating as a reader, and someone who is empathizing with you, and then finding out that maybe it was because there was a pool nearby that wasn't being cared for, and and
Exactly.
that there was just this, that it could have been prevented, like him sitting out in your backyard, got this innocuous mosquito bite, and then he ends up in a coma, and you lose him. And how old were you when you lost him?
I was in my 40s.
You were in your 40s. Okay, so very
Yeah,
young.
yeah, he had
Yeah.
just turned 50. And that's his immune system was compromised because of the MS. And because the new medication wasn't quite kicking in, and he was really struggling, like I said, just as a course of treatment, as protocol, Joel was on IV steroids. So we had a nurse coming to the house for 5 days, and Joel was on an IV drip with these steroids that were exponentially stronger than any oral steroids he had taken before, which again is protocol for people with MS. To just, it kind of just gives your system a boost. But it was being on those steroids that really lowered his immune system, that made him susceptible to a mosquito bite. And like you said, we had a neighbor who had sold her house, a developer had purchased it, and really let the entire house, including the pool in the backyard, go into complete disarray. So it's suspected that this mosquito came from the swamp like pool next door. And the timing was such that my husband got bit by a mosquito and it caused him to die. It's really surreal.
It is, yeah. And I think one of the things about your book that's so effective is that you take the reader on your journey, like your experience of how hard it was to process these things. And even though you could see that he was in the ICU, you didn't even really register that he was in a coma. And people would tell you that, and you'd say, "What are you talking about?" And that's dissociation. That's something our brains do when we simply, the enormity of whatever we're going through is so traumatic that we just literally can't deal with it, and so we just kind of split off. And it's very effective at getting us through short-term challenges, and not effective as a long-term life strategy. I've dealt with it a lot. So one of the things about your experience in the grieving, and why I wanted to talk with you, is um that there's definitely, you have a sense of humor about your experience as well as it being very sad. And like, I felt like I lost Joel reading the book. Like, it was, you
Mm.
definitely took me with you and brought him to life for me as a reader. um but there's this scene where it's been probably several months, if I'm remembering right, where he's been gone, and you've gone through the whole, funeral and all that stuff. And then one day you call one of your friends and you say, "I'm a widow." And I just started laughing out loud, because I can totally get that dissociation of, like, that just sort of hadn't occurred to you. Can you talk a little bit about that process of just kind of not being in touch with really what was happening, and how that all felt for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question, Stephanie. I, of course, knew intellectually that I lost my husband and that made me a widow. Um, I think that it was the disconnect of losing the love of my life. We had a happy marriage and a strong marriage. So I still felt married, but my husband wasn't here. And I couldn't connect the dots. Like, I'm married, but no, I'm a widow. So, and it was also about the reason I call the book Widowish is because, I didn't look like a widow. I was young. I didn't act like a widow because anybody who would see me at Trader Joe's or, picking up my daughter from school, they just saw another mom in Los Angeles, like living her life. But I felt like a widow. And widowish is really the reconciling of like how I was perhaps perceived in the world and how I felt. And so, in saying and calling my friend that day and saying I'm a widow, and she had the same reaction that I did. It was like, oh my God, you're right. Because even though Joel was gone, he's still so much a part of my life to this day. And it's been 7 years. I still feel his presence. I still feel that he is in my life and our daughter's life. And I still feel married, even though I have a significant other, and we've been together for 6 years, and he and I got together soon after I lost my husband, which contributed to this idea that I wasn't really acting like a widow. Um, but I miss Joel every day, and it's the presence of his absence that is really profound and felt all the time.
That was a beautiful description. And the other thing that occurred to me was that just like when you get a chronic illness diagnosis like Joel did, it changes your self-perception, your identity. It's like, well, what does it mean for me to be the same person, but now I have MS? For you, it
Right.
was, what does it mean for me to be the same person and still love my husband, but he's gone, so therefore I'm this word widow that doesn't really make sense to how I feel, and yet it describes me. And I think part of resilience is being able to move with some sort of ease into new identities as they're presented to us throughout our lives. But what do you think about that?
About the idea of resilience.
Mhm.
And, I think I just knew I had to keep moving forward. And I think because we had a young daughter, I I mean she's always my priority no matter what, but especially in the aftermath of losing my husband, her father, I felt a tremendous responsibility. And I say, she's an only child, I became an only parent. Um, there's no relief from I have friends who are divorced and they can't wait for the weekend. They miss their kids, but they need the weekend off to just have their me time. That wasn't an option for me. And Joel was a very involved and loving parent. So his absence was profoundly felt. And I really made Sophie, our daughter, my focus. And that helped me, or that really is what gave me the strength to just keep moving forward. And I just took it like every day, one day at a time. If I can get through today, if I can get her up and keep her on schedule, because she was in school and had an active life, which was great because I kind of used that to help me. Like I just needed to get her from point A to point B, and then I would kind of follow suit.
Yeah. And so then you moved into helping others with this experience. You towards the end of the book, you have a group at group gathering at a home for other widows and widowers. Tell us what that was like for you, and is that something you're still involved with?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm mostly involved just in my writing, which is how that group got started. Is I've always made my living as a writer, as you said. Um, and I was in a writing group. It was one of the first things that I did for myself at the invitation of a close friend who invited me to a writing group. And it was in that group I was writing a novel. I was working on short stories. And the same friend said to me, "It would be so great if you started writing about the things that you're going through. Like you just lost your husband, you're an only parent, like you're not writing about any of that." And I completely balked at that idea. I never wrote personally. I never dreamed about writing a personal essay. I couldn't imagine that I would want to share myself in that way. But I couldn't let go of that idea that maybe I should be writing about this. And once I started, I couldn't stop. And so I started writing these personal essays about being a young widow and an only parent, and eventually falling in love again, and while still grieving. And I started publishing those essays, and they were in the LA Times and the New York Times and the Washington Post. I had a column on the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed. I was publishing, publishing, publishing. And that's when I started hearing from people for whom my story resonated. And they weren't necessarily all widows. They were people who had been divorced or gone through an unexpected life change, but somehow my essays were helpful to them. And that was such a gift. And that really resulted in the beginning of this young widow group I started here in Los Angeles, where I live, with another young widow friend who I made, who she reached out to me when she heard about my situation. And we became very good friends. So we started this group, and it really has been amazing to gather with people. You know, we say we speak the same language, this language of grief. And I'm sure I say this in the book also, but we're all widowish. Like, none of us look like, I say something like, if a stranger were to walk into one of our meetings, they would think we're a group of parents planning a school event or part of a book club, or, we're just not the typical idea of widowhood. And so that's been great. Just hearing from other people, knowing that my story is helping them is, like I said, it's just such a gift.
Yeah. And having gone through this experience, how do you define resilience?
I think the ability to move forward, and that's just something you say sort of in the grief space. You never move on. It's not like I'm over my husband, and I'm not over our life together and over our marriage and the life we had, but I have just moved forward from that point in my life where I lost him. But like I said earlier, I still feel that he's with me. He's still very much a part of our lives, and that is a feeling I'm also so grateful for.
That's wonderful. My last question is always, what are some self-care resilient strategies that you like and use to take care of yourself?
You know what, Stephanie? I have to say, like, I've got to get outside every day. And I think because of COVID, um, my life really isn't so drastically different than it was pre-COVID, because I've always been a writer. I've always worked from home. I was always disciplined around this is my job. So in that sense, I was home anyway. But I do miss, um, my husband became a yoga person and he got me into it. So I do miss going to yoga, and I realize how important just that mind body connection, the ability to breathe. So I really force myself to just get in my neighborhood every day with my mask on, go for a walk or a bike ride, and just to kind of breathe the way I would in a yoga class. Just breathe, and that really sustains me. I know it sounds very simple, but sometimes it's those simple little things that make the biggest difference. So for me, that's just moving and breathing. And again, like I said, writing has been the most healing thing for me. And also the gift in that, like I said, is my writing is helping other people. So it's just like this nice kind of cycle of love, I guess,
That's
going
wonderful.
out, coming back.
Yeah. And what I love is that I get different answers from everyone to that question. So it's always really fun for me to hear how someone defines it and what they think of as their self-care rituals. Melissa, thank you again for being here today and sharing your story. Please visit widowish.com to learn more about her work. And you can find her book, Widowish, a memoir, wherever books are sold. Check out other episodes of the Resilience series on Facebook Watch, IGTV, and YouTube. And follow me at SWeaverMPH to learn more about my upcoming book, The Migraine Relief Plan Cookbook, which is due out in spring 2022 from Surrey Books. Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks, Stephanie.